student at University College London, and Helen Chersky is my supervisor. I'm here to also talk about the ocean and about the atmosphere as well. And I will talk about the mechanism controlling bubble-mediated air-sea fluxes. So what we're doing is studying how the lower atmosphere interacts with the upper ocean. So as a consequence, there is an exchange of gas fluxes across this interface, such as the carbon dioxide flux, which is a very important greenhouse gas. So there is an upward carbon dioxide flux like this map shows here with the yellow and the red colors, and there's also a downward carbon dioxide flux shown here by the blue and purple colors. Up to 1/3 of the total anthropogenic carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean, like my colleague said. So the ocean becomes an essential regulator for the climate system. Another consequence is the production of aerosol particles. Aerosol particles are biogenic and sea salt particles which can influence the formation of clouds and can also alter the radiation coming from the sun. So the aerosol forcing induces high uncertainty in the climate models. At high winds over the sea surface, there are waves of many waves are generated of many wavelengths and frequencies. And as the waves become unstable, they begin to break here. You see here an example, and they trap air from the atmosphere and inject it into the upper ocean in the form of bubbles. Now, these bubbles organize in bubble plumes and can enhance the downward carbon dioxide flux. One of our aims is to understand and observe this phenomenon in the real ocean. On the other hand, the larger, more buoyant bubbles rise up from the bubble plumes at the sea surface and form white foam patches, what we call whitecaps. These here. The bubbles within the whitecaps burst and release the aerosols, which are carried upward into the atmosphere. This is another aim. Another aim is to also understand this phenomenon in the real ocean. The carbon dioxide flux is defined as the product between the transfer velocity K and a concentration difference between the water and the air. So this plot shows here the variation of the transfer velocity with wind speed, and the transfer velocity becomes highly uncertain as the wind speed is increasing. Many people measure the transfer velocity with wind speed, but the problem is that the transfer velocity is only an environmental condition. It doesn't provide a mechanism that can explain this variation in the transfer velocity. So we think that the bubble mechanisms that I just described can explain these variations in the transfer velocity. So for our observation, we went at sea for 6 weeks on the Knorr research vessel here. It's an American vessel. In the North Atlantic here, you can see part of Greenland here and part of Canada here. We had a total running time of over 200 hours within a wind speed range between 4 and 30 meters per second. We measured many parameters with many instruments. So it's a challenge to incorporate all these measurements and to make physical sense of them. We also are engaged within the High Wings project, which comes from High Wind Gas Exchange Study, which is a British-American collaboration. And the overall aim of this project is to validate a parameterization scheme that describes the bubble-mediated air-sea fluxes within an ocean-atmosphere coupled model. So for our bubble measurements, we used acoustical and optical instruments that we attached along an 11 meters long spar buoy here. The spar buoy was floating upright over the ocean in storms. So that was the point to do the measurements in storms, in high winds, with the instruments always facing the winds and the waves. So the instruments are going from the top to the bottom of the buoy. The foam camera here, which was capturing the whitecaps, the wave wire there, which which were measuring the wave frequency and amplitude. Under the sea surface, you had a bubble camera, which was retrieving the bubble size distribution. Below, we had the resonators measuring the void fraction, which is the total volume of water occupied by bubbles within the upper ocean. And at the bottom of the buoy, we had a sonar, which was scanning vertically the upper ocean for bubbles with 120 acoustical beams for each pulse. So we had at each pulse, so we had 6 pulses per second. Each pulse can produce such a sonar image here showing the bubble plumes. So for an entire deployment of over 35 hours, so we had over 35 hours of straight measurements, we can have more than 500,000 sonar images like these ones. I chose a subdomain here from the sonar images, and I averaged it over a time interval, and I obtained what I call the sonar matrix, which is a high-resolution representation of how the sonar sees, a vertical representation of how the sonar sees the waves, and in this case, a bubble plume event building up and dying away in time. The colors represent the backscatter intensities generated by the bubbles. And by looking at the lowest positions within the sonar matrix, I can generate the maximum bubble plume depth, which becomes very important when I will compare it to carbon dioxide fluxes in complex environmental conditions. A comparison between the instruments measuring the bubbles has been made here. We have the bubble camera at the top, the resonator in the middle, and the sonar at the bottom. One of the big challenges here is that analyzing large time series and comparing large time series becomes fiddly because in this example, the instruments didn't have the same sampling frequency. So these can lead to a very important undersampling phenomenon. And also, the instruments didn't operate exactly simultaneously all the time. So there can be a time lag between the time series. So very careful time synchronizing is necessary, of course. In this case, the instruments see one main plume event here. The resonator and the sonar show a particular good agreement, but the sonar overestimates the detection of the events because the sonar is more sensitive to signals coming from smaller bubbles, from very small bubbles, actually. So what I did is just filter the signal, and I adjusted the maximum bubble plume depth, which fits better with the resonator data. This is the original plume depth and the adjusted plume depth in this image. Yes. So what I need is to motivate my decision. I need to motivate my decision and to quantify how the resonator detects the events relative to the sonar. So one way to do that is to impose a void fraction threshold in the resonator data, and also a depth threshold at the depth where the resonator is located in the sonar data. So the resonator detects the events as the void fraction values, which are above the threshold, and the sonar detects the events as the values below the threshold there. So for the resonator and the sonar to detect the main and relevant events, it's very hard to decide which are the relevant events here. I have a maximum gap length of 21 seconds, allowed gap length of 21 seconds. The gap length means, the gap length means this, the values which are the void fraction values which fall below the threshold, and the plume depth values which are above the threshold there. So by considering different combinations of gap lengths between the resonator and the sonar, I can obtain a good agreement between the adjusted plume depth and the void fraction resonator data. I can use this adjusted plume depth to generate different kinds of statistics, such as bubble plume depth variation at different wind speeds. This is a probability distribution which shows the bubble plume depth, the maximum bubble plume depth varying at 3 different average wind speeds. At 10 meters per second, the curve shows that most events have a maximum plume depth closer to the surface at about 2.5 meters. The curve changes as the wind speed increases with at at 25 meters per second, the curve shows that most events are at deeper levels at about 5 meters deep. In conclusion, we want to analyze individual breaking waves further in order to look at the feeding mechanism of the whitecaps with the bubbles rising from the bubble plumes. This mechanism can explain the variation of aerosol production with whitecap fraction. In order to quantify this mechanism, this feeding mechanism, we want to look at how the bubble size distribution changes during the plume events and with bubble plume depth. This process will explain how the variation, this process can explain the variation of the downward carbon dioxide flux with bubble plume depth. On the other way, we want to also look at the large-scale statistics and of analyzing the dynamics of whitecaps and plumes in different wind and sea state conditions. This will allow us to see if the bubble plume depth variation can be a mechanism by which we can accurately predict the carbon dioxide flux in complex environmental conditions. And also we want to look at want to see if the whitecap fraction variation can also be a mechanism by which we can predict the production of aerosols in complex environmental conditions. Thank you very much.